Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this HTT webinar featuring Volterra. This one's called Electrifying at Scale, What Fleet Managers Need to Know to Overcome the Charging Infrastructure Complexities. And believe me, they are many. When you start wading into this problem, you'll see how complex it can get. Hopefully after today, you'll be a little more familiar with the challenge and able to tackle it at least toe-to-toe and take it as it comes. I'd like to introduce today's speakers to you. We have Tom Ashley with us. He's the Vice President of Government and Utility Operations at Volterra Power, and Hannah Jacobus. She's the Vice President of Real Estate and Development at Volterra Power. My name's Jim Park. I'm the Equipment Editor at Heavy Duty Trucking Magazine. Thanks again for joining us today. We've got a pretty good agenda for you, so I'm just going to go over quickly what we're going to cover today. And hopefully that'll give you some idea of what this webinar is going to be all about and what you can take away from it at the end. We're going to start with the state of the market. It's exciting is another word for challenging, really, but it is an interesting time for fleets, and there's all sorts of new opportunities to achieve zero emissions transportation on a large scale. Some would say that our fingertips. We've got a little bit of work to do to get there, and we're obviously trying now to establish a robust charging infrastructure, and we're learning that that can be a pretty daunting process. But after today, I think you'll have a much better understanding of where we can go with that. Obviously, some of the challenges is getting the right power to the right place at the right time. We're going to take a look at some of the core challenges fleet operators are facing as they navigate this complex EV infrastructure landscape. And we're going to leave you with 3 key tips that'll help you going forward in your plans to electrify. I just want to throw in a shameless plug here for HDT Talks Trucking, our video podcast series. We did an interview a little while ago with Volterra's CEO, Matt Horton. And that was a pretty good video, pretty good explanation of what's going on. So after you finish with this webinar, go over and check out our video. You can find it on our YouTube channel, or it's on the HTT website, truckinginfo.com. So what do you say we dig in here? I'm going to hand the speaker's chair over to Tom Ashley right now, and we'll get us started and to see what the future that's coming our way looks like. So Tom, take it away, sir.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. So let's just start a little bit more with kind of the market perspective and what's happening. And I just want to make a note that I think we're seeing a lot of interesting media coverage of the market, EV sales, kind of what's going on subsequent to some of the significant federal legislative packages here in the U.S. And so I think for today, while we're focused on talking about infrastructure for heavy-duty truck fleets, I would acknowledge that the last sales figures for California on the light-duty side, California is approaching 30% of new vehicle sales as electric in the light-duty space. And in the light-duty fleet space, we're seeing cities in particular make moves with their own fleets. And we're also seeing some major cities evaluating pretty significant regulation associated with taxi and rideshare space. That being said, I think part of the pace on light duty is going faster because there are less infrastructure challenges. These are also significantly vehicles that are personal vehicles, going to someone's house, garage, etc. But when we're talking about fleet, particularly heavy-duty fleet, there are a lot of challenges associated with infrastructure development, deployment, and management. And while I suspect many of the fleet personnel, managers, etc., who are with us today have gotten a fair perspective on what some of those challenges are, I think what I would share, I work with a lot of policymakers, regulators, et cetera, and I think there's always surprise at really how much is involved with developing, deploying, even just planning for infrastructure. And a lot of the surprise is really associated with the timeline. So we'll be talking a little bit about that today. But big message here is that this does take time. And we'll be sharing some thoughts on how to maximize the time, as well as kind of what the reality of that timeline means for working forward in this space. What I'd also like to share is that while there is a lot of complexity with planning, developing, deploying, managing this infrastructure, there are also a lot of let's call it easy buttons that can be pressed. And so we'll share a little bit about that in the context of Volterra today. I think we can go to the next slide, Jim.
Great. So when you're starting to think about your implementation of EV charging at scale, there's a lot of key challenges that you're going to want to get on top of early in the timeline. Many fleet managers are challenged by the fact that the infrastructure that they're going to need doesn't exist today. It's not in the right place, the right time that they're going to need it, and therefore pivot to this plan of developing it for themselves. What then comes is a series of challenges to do that, including siting, building, owning, operating these facilities at scale without significant disruptions in operations, business, not to mention the upfront capital that's going to be required to execute that strategy. So even with these challenges, there are things we want to share, things you can do to try to make this go as smooth as possible and get on top of it early. We have a couple highlighted here on the screen. Really, there's some at every step of the process, but we want to share a little bit about these two highlighted here. So the due diligence process of finding these sites and making sure that they're going to work for what you need to do is a lot more in depth than what you might have been familiar with to find a warehouse, an office, more traditional types of real estate. The infrastructure that has to go into the site is more in depth and takes a lot more time. So you've got to find, land that can be developed for what you need it to be developed for at a price that's going to work in your budget. Then you have to layer on top of that, being able to permit that land for what you're going to need to use it for. And then finally layer on the addition of providing that power to the property as Jim highlighted early on. So there's a trifecta of things that you have to bring together for these sites to work. And, often the land that you're trying to find to bring all of these pieces together is where everybody else wants to do the same thing too. So there's going to be some supply constraints, some competition for the properties. That's going to make the process more competitive, drive prices up and make things a little more difficult as well. Then, on the permitting side, you've got municipalities who are dealing in a new, ambiguous environment as well as us, learning alongside everybody. And they're going to be challenged to, color outside the lines, come up with interpretations that ultimately you will need to get your site developed. So you'll want to have those discussions early. And then finally, we have power procurement listed here, which is, an easy couple words for what is a process that will survive the whole timeline of your project. Starting from inception of an idea, you're going to need to get in front of utilities who often have capacity constraints, resource constraints. You're going to need their partnership with you to really understand how that's going to impact the cost and schedule of your overall project. So that's a little more in depth about these challenges that are going to come ahead. And we want to arm you with just a few tools that you can think about throughout that process to at least understand it, get ahead of it. Anything to add, Tom?
Yeah, so Jim, I might just add, Volterra is doing this every day, and Hannah in particular, is doing this work every day for our customers. I'm sure there's some fleet managers on today who are wondering, why are we talking about real estate? Hey, maybe that's what Volterra does, but why is real estate relevant for me or for us? And, this is, at least in my view, and Hannah, you may want to add, but, I think what we're seeing a lot of fleets encounter is that through this transition process from their existing or otherwise combustion engine vehicles to zero emission vehicles, their existing fleet depot facilities or the ecosystem in which they've been fueling their vehicles may not fit the need or the opportunity through this transition, whether that's in terms of power capacity available at the site, or whether indeed zero emission vehicles present sort of new operating models and opportunities associated with that. So we'll be happy to talk about that more if there are questions, but just wanted to reflect that there are a lot of ways to do this, but I think we're seeing a lot of fleets really look creatively beyond sort of their own facilities to figure out their best pathway to nearest term electrification or transition.
I just wanted to point out, we will have a Q&A session at the end of this. We're going to save 15 minutes or so towards the end for any questions. So if you have a question, you can put that into the field at the bottom of your screen, and that'll queue up, and we'll get to that as we wrap up the presentations. Hannah, I wanted to ask you, when you're talking about real estate and the various markets that these fleets are in, given that they've probably already got an existing terminal somewhere, is the transition more or less complicated to try and electrify your current space than to move into a fresh area that's basically ready for the picking? Is there a lot of conversion to do on an existing terminal?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. And I don't know that one really beats out the other. They certainly both come with their complexities, both on, finding a new property that can work. And then on your existing site, you're certainly going to have a disruption to operations. There's going to be a lot of analysis similar to a new site that needs to be done to qualify if that site can be transitioned successfully into housing and operating EV chargers, both from an infrastructure standpoint and site suitability, plus how that integrates with the current layout operations. We've been finding people have a hard time continuing to do everything they were originally doing at those depots, plus add this, fueling, charging capacity to that same site. So people have been turning to, I think, slower, like pieces at a time, but needing to supplement that elsewhere, not to mention other locations, right? Diversity of access to that charging helps people feel comfortable about their transportation plans, where they need to go, that it'll be available along the routes that you have planned and need that guarantee for.
So there's an awful lot to consider, just not moving down the street because there's some acreage available.
That's right.
Okay. Are we ready to move on to the next slide?
I think so.
Okay, here we go. Back to you, Hannah.
All
Over
right.
to you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, sorry.
So
My bad.
Here's tip number one. And on the one hand, it's simple. Don't wait in developing your EV infrastructure strategy. So simple to say, I think a bit harder in practice to take forward. But the big message is this does take time, even if you're pressing an easy button and working with a company like Volterra or others in our industry who help make a lot of these things easier than having the fleets manage in-house. But even in that scenario, it does take time for you to run forward with even just the power procurement process, let alone equipment procurement or a lot of other aspects of this. And so the big message is don't wait. I think we're seeing different data around the industry, including in different segments. But general rule of thumb, I think we tend to see about 18 to 24 months for utilities to enable sites to charge or electrify at reasonable scale. So 18 to 24 months just for that power procurement process. And as Hannah mentioned, that's something that, because of that timeline, really needs to be running concurrently with a lot of other aspects of planning, development, and deployment. So I think what we have on screen here is, hey, if you want to be charging at a facility in 2025, you need to start now. I think it's 2026, you need to start now. So that may be not what everyone wants to hear. Certainly those fleets who are looking at regulatory compliance deadlines that are certainly sooner than that. But really, you want to take the opportunity to give yourself, give your utility partner, give your charging partners the time that it takes to do a great job setting up this infrastructure for this transition. I would also share, in a place like California, we're pretty well past kind of the early mover advantage for a lot of fleets. And we're now in a scenario where a lot of fleets are really focused on regulatory compliance because they're subject to new regulation that goes live really in just a few weeks. And so in other geographic markets, in other segments, or fleets that are not subject to some of those regulations, there may still be some early mover advantages. But I think what we're going to be seeing a lot more of is recognition of the economic benefits associated with this transition, and a lot of financial motivation to make this transition. I think the early mover advantage associated with kind of the economic side of this is that there are incentives available in many markets now, both for vehicles and infrastructure. And while certain infrastructure incentives, notably the tax credit at the federal level, are likely to continue for some time, some of those vehicle incentives may be very time limited. And they will go to the fleets that are soonest to transition. Hannah, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, Tom, I guess I'd just add, while it may feel like, this is early to wrap your brain around what you need, where you need it, I think what we're indicating is just having some of these early discussions will both inform you to inform your strategy and inform partners that you're going to need in the market of what's coming to pave the way down the road for these things to happen. Most notably so the utility, but a lot of the other preparation and engagement that you're going to have to do. So, don't be afraid to reach out, have discussions, and not have all the answers right away. I think that's what we're finding kind of spends a lot of time in the early stage when there all of a sudden is a rush to go live in 12 months. It's understanding the need. So that's a great place to start.
Yeah, thanks. And Jim, I think I'd just maybe wrap up on this first tip with, a few more kind of practical components. So again, the big message is don't wait, but understanding, okay, well, how do I operationalize this? What steps do I take in relation to not waiting? So you just heard from Hannah. I think one of the easiest, earliest steps that a fleet can take before they've really thought very much about planning, have a real sense of how many or how quickly they're going to transition their vehicles, is to call up their utility partner and let the utility know that, hey, we want to figure out what we need to do to think about how to electrify our site, or otherwise how to electrify our fleet in relation to our operational routing and needs. So I think that's a very practical step. It's very easy. There's really little or no research or preparation that is needed to do that. But also, as Hannah mentioned, it's helpful to look around, do some research, some of the charging partners that are out there. Many of the automotive manufacturers themselves have resources to share around charging both actual equipment as well as strategies. So just want to acknowledge very easy kind of starting point in communicating with your utility partner. And I know many fleets have multiple, in some cases, many utility partners. And so that can be either site specific or across an operational geography.
Tom, when you're talking about the utility companies, I would imagine they're in the process now of sort of load planning, trying to figure out what future loads are going to be on their particular grids in a given area. So if you're planning an installation like this, you're going to be consuming a lot of power. They have to account for that in their growth plans as well. Are you seeing reluctance on their part, on the utilities' part, to be upfront with the fleets on when this might happen? And if you don't get in now, you may wind up having to pay for an additional transformer or substation somewhere. Is this outside the realm of this discussion? But I kind of think they need to know what's going on in the background.
Sure, Jim. Happy to share some perspective. I would say as, uncomfortable or challenging as this transition may be for many fleets, it is also for many utilities. There are kind of new requests. There are pressure sometimes from very key Fortune 500 customers around the timelines to do this. So the utility community, I think, in many regards, is under a lot of pressure right now to evolve existing practices, processes, to decide what new and how many of those new resources may be required to adequately serve the transition. And there are a lot of other aspects of this transition, right? It's not just zero-emission vehicles and the electrification of the transportation sector. We're also seeing utilities in many geographies being asked to support electrification of buildings, to transition the generation mix of their electricity to renewable. So there's a lot going on that utilities are facing or working on right now. Jim, what I would say is the utilities that are in, let's say, California again, they're not being surprised by, the asks they're getting from these fleets. That's not to say that they're adequately resourced to deliver quick turns, but the California utilities have been on notice for quite a while. They've been engaged by the charging industry, regulators, fleets for many years in this space. I think that what I've observed is some of the utilities in other geographies are not yet self-aware about how much and how quickly some of these challenges can come onto the table for them. And so I think that's something that we want to keep in mind. That's part of the messaging that I just shared, and frankly, the utility community has been sharing about just having that conversation with the utility as early as possible. Because in that scenario, the utility is not going to be surprised that you're looking to electrify or transition your fleet or your facility or set of facilities. But Jim, this may be a little wonky, but what we're going to be facing as an industry is the need to evolve the regulatory paradigm that governs a lot of the regulated utilities in this country. So ones that have a state regulator that regulates what they do, how much money they spend, what they can charge for rates. Because big picture, most jurisdictions in this country from a regulatory standpoint have taken an approach that I would describe as just in time. And so utilities are really set up to respond and react to load requests made by customers, whether it's for electrification or a new manufacturing facility. and they haven't been set up to build ahead of that demand. And that's functionally what is being implicated in many of the geographies that have a lot of fleets that will be transitioning, is utilities effectively have to build ahead of the specific demand load letter request made by a facility or fleet that is seeking to transition. I think we should flip to the next slide, and then we can maybe dig in a little bit further in the Q&A on this, Jim.
Yeah, this will help us understand the timeline a little bit more clearly too, I think.
Yeah.
Hannah, take it away.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jim. So I want to give people here a more in-depth idea of all the different phases in this development life cycle that are going to drive towards that 18 to 24 months that Tom mentioned, and both get you a familiarity with the steps that are going to be involved, potentially the risks that come with the steps, and then the durations and how they stack on top of each other. So you can get an idea of why we kind of speak on repeat about starting this process early. So again, you don't have to have all the answers, but if you can start with a basic understanding of what your goals are, it's good to get these conversations early. These timelines of phases in this development definitely are not sequential. It's not kind of a domino, but there's a lot that's going to be going on in parallel and is going to drive off of the information from one stage to the next. So everything is interrelated. And each one of these pieces, like if any of them start to go off in a different direction, you've got some risk with your utility, your municipality, things you have to work through, environmental issues. That's going to spike your timeline in a different direction, which is why we try to build in that buffer for really the unknown and the unplanned, because this is new for a lot of people going through the process. So I'm going to talk specifically, you see here a picture, an image of actually one of our first Volterra operational sites that's in the Long Beach area. This was a site built for heavy duty trucks to charge about 60 of them in that area. And I think it's a good example as I walk through these stages of a real life application of how this played out. And this project actually from, inception of the idea to the end will be about 2.5 years. So in more complicated markets, you can see that it will start to spike past that comfortable zone of what you might have been planning or hoping for. So this project, and if you're planning for yourselves, we'll start with the site identification process. But to show some of that nuance and that stage in and of itself can be anywhere from 1 to 3 months. And you might think like, what's going on there? Why does it take so long to get to a site that works? We found, and in this case particularly, we had to look at dozens of sites to find this one that ended up, again, bringing together all those pieces that I indicated early on. So you're going to have to expect to be kind of looking at sites, probably touring, reviewing desktop information about them, starting to put them into that funnel of then what goes into a due diligence process to learn and qualify and understand the risk that will come with needing to develop this infrastructure on top of them for your project. So a couple of the key, pieces of what to look for in sites, and this will be a little bit unique for each use case as Volterra goes into a project. We want to balance having as much information we can about what the ideal site looks like, but keeping our minds open to catch all of the opportunities in a given geography. So, in this case, we were looking within the bounds of as close to the Port of Long Beach as possible for a particular route that was needed to be run. We were wanting to find sites with good access, highway access. Access can mean different things for different fleets. Site characteristics, how you get in and out of the site, how the flow is going to work, the shape of the site, and then, of course, what that deal is going to look like. If it's a parcel that needs a heavy amount of development, how that's going to be priced in. Owning versus leasing is a whole other analysis topic you can get into when you consider how you want to invest in this infrastructure. And that'll really impact the timeline of your upfront acquisition as well. Those structures come with different timeline implications and are driven by competition in the market, excuse me, but will also lead to how you can evaluate the rest of the risks on the site outside of the real estate deal. And then that kind of sends us into this more in-depth due diligence period, which, at Volterra, we take that pretty seriously. We're developing a pretty strong capability to understand all the risks associated with development of EV infrastructure. Those things include, probably most important to lease, things that we've talked about a little bit already today. Obviously, that power procurement. Then we've got understanding land use dynamics. This is a new use for most municipalities. And while you might be more familiar with industrial depot development, this doesn't fit in a perfect box. So you can expect between that power procurement and potentially understanding and changing land use, that can swing your timeline again from maybe 6 months up to this 2.5 years or so that we ended up having play out at this property for us in the Long Beach area. So those are top two of your assessments you'll want to make as you're diligencing a site. But there's a laundry list of other risk mitigation items you're going to want to evaluate. Environmental, if there's any mitigation you'll have to do, the extent of construction or demo you'll have to do for projects if they're already set up for parking or trucking or whatever the case may be. And then what's most important as you come to the end of that is, what does that mean for your cost at the end of the day? And that's how you'll have to compare these sites to one another, both, maybe existing sites, new sites, lease, own, and constructability all lead to what's the cost going to be for me, for my fleet to transition over the next year, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. And that's a big hurdle, at Volterra that we take pretty seriously to make sure our solutions are in line with what fleets who are transitioning can make pencil. It's an important piece to making this all happen. And then, I'd just touch briefly after these things that are shown on the screen, which are really focused on the upfront process. Then we kind of tip into more of the construction timeline, but not to make it less important, because as you get to the end of this, you acquire your site, you're heading into design. One of the next biggest timeline risks, as Tom mentioned earlier, is procuring your long lead equipment. And I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that a lot of the electrical equipment is often delayed in the market today. Selecting and understanding your chargers or who's going to operate those comes with a pretty significant lead time. So wanting to get that started early on in your design process in partnership with the utility, because that utility process, as mentioned, is a multi-stage involvement every step of the way, including equipment selection, and they will be partnering with you on your procurement. That's, a big piece of the timeline that can swing things. We're certainly seeing some equipment can take up to 12 months. So again, just stack that in with everything else, and you start to get the picture of how these things are just an uphill battle for a lot of us at this time. And then I'll just kind of close that out as you head towards the actual delivery of the project. You'll be completing your design, getting the rest of your permits, and then the actual construction timeline of these facilities can vary, based on structures you might want to put on the site. But I'd say, 4 to 6 months at the end of that timeline there to build it, and then go to your final stage of commissioning the chargers and having them come online.
You talked about the cost of moving this forward. I've never seen a project yet go forward where the estimated price held through all the way through the end after 24 or 36 months. What sort of protection is built in for the fleet on the cost that they agreed to go in and start this versus what they end up paying at the end of the project? Is that really a dramatic change in your experience?
Yeah, Jim, we're all learning about a lot of these dynamics, and that is definitely held true. I mean, you certainly in the construction world build in your contingency, and with the utilities, there's an understanding that there's a range of variability, but you're absolutely right. I think things are often coming in higher than people have estimated. At Volterra, we're developing that core capability to ensure those things stay in line with certainly what an expectation in the market is and not more, but on the lower end of, what we're promising to customers. So there's a partnership, decisions get made every step of the way, and we certainly plan for the unknown the best as we can with, contingency and detailed research and experience. We've been through this a handful of times, and I would say to others to make sure with other partners, which we'll talk about here in a minute, just some other key partners you're going to want to pay attention to, that you do hold them accountable and make sure at the very least you ask the question early on about categories of spend, risk associated with it, where potential swings could come from, when you can lock in prices for design, construction, equipment, and what the potential variability is on those contracts. So I think that's a great flag for everyone to pay attention to those things early on.
Okay, before we get to the next slide, just want to remind everybody there is going to be a Q&A at the end of this session. We've got a couple of questions queued up in the down below here. If you have a question, please type it in the bottom of your screen and it'll appear in the queue. And when we get done with the presentations, we'll get over to the questions. So let's now advance to slide 1 and talk about enlisting the help of EV infrastructure experts, which by the sound of things you're going to need going into this. It's nice to have somebody in your corner.
Yeah, and thanks, Jim. I think this can take many colors. Certainly we at Volterra look at ourselves as a one-stop shop for people to help from the very inception of idea of transition all the way to, fully operational, making sure you have your needs met every day. And there are others that do the same. What I might highlight for everyone is a few key categories within that development life cycle that I talked about, where subject matter experts are going to be important. And, early dialogue with those, if you choose to engage them directly, is important. Even at Volterra, we see the value in these subject matter experts, and not only subject, but regional. As Tom mentioned, utilities are one example of things that vary by region, but also do, zoning code and local development code and, just geographic and environmental impacts. So you're going to want to understand the locality of what you're developing. So as you move across that timeline, there's really people that are in each category of this that can help you to the extent you want to bring in some outside help. On the real estate side, you can certainly engage your real estate broker, who of course you want to have that local knowledge of the market, supply, demand, pricing, owners, sellers, landlords, to help you set up your acquisition for success and get you the best terms possible. And then on, the due diligence side, we always look for a local engineering partner who has localized experience. They definitely will help you drive your design concept, your layout, your need as far as equipment goes, but they will also advise you on a lot of these other due diligence pieces that impact that design, how it comes together, what the restrictions of it are, what's actually developable. It's great to kind of sketch out in your mind, I need 50 trucks. This seems like this will fit. But we've found that vary quite a bit once you get that local knowledge in there to show what can actually be done. On the permitting front, you've got local land use attorneys, other council consultants, You may choose to engage public affairs consultants, depending on how in-depth your strategy will need to be with that municipality. And then finally, as you head into construction, you're going to want to get a great local build partner, balance that scale and national presence, again, with the local expertise of somebody who can pick up the ball from your engineering partners, understand who works where and how they can pull different levers for you and bring that project really to success at the end of the day. So I think those are a few of the key categories of consultants, of experts that you should be thinking about and your partners should be thinking about. And yeah, Tom, any others you want to add?
Well, yeah. So it may not be relevant for all the fleets that are on with us today, but again, I mentioned sort of incentives, and in a place like California, fairly rich incentive landscape. That's also there's a little bit of probably not a gold rush, but there's a lot of motivation economically for fleets to leverage the incentive environment in a place like California. But incentives exist in a lot of other geographies. The federal tax credit is not in every census tract, but it is available in every state. And many utilities have incentive programs as well. And so I think that's a very easy example of a type of expertise that fleets would be well advised to engage right away to make sure that they're not missing anything and are best positioned to leverage the incentive environment that exists today or in an ongoing manner, again, both for vehicles and potentially for infrastructure.
A question that occurs to me, and you've probably dealt with this many times. Fleets come to you saying, geez, we tried to go this alone. It wasn't what we were expecting. We need help. What are some of the common misconceptions or pitfalls that you've seen fleets experience, or going into this on their own didn't realize, what lay ahead of them? What are some of the more common things that you've heard? Not to scare anybody away from trying this on their own, but I'm sure the road to salvation is littered with all kinds of bodies here who've tried it going on their own.
Yeah, Jim, I mean, we don't want to make out that this is rocket science, but there is a lot of complexity involved. And I think that's, in my experience, one of the big surprises for a lot of organizations as they're working through this transition, that it is more complex than they anticipate. Some of those complexities can potentially have either snowball effects or can present as true barriers. Right? We talked a little bit earlier about, well, why are we talking about real estate? The reality is that it's not as simple as just electrifying the facility that an organization may currently be using for a number of different reasons. And so I would just acknowledge that, this is definitely something that fleets can do themselves with partners. But the more the fleet wants to take on or needs to take on themselves, the more they need to staff and resource that. And I think that's one of the challenges. There's a lot of really great job development going on in this industry right now. But I think a lot of fleets are really faced with, the fairly basic decision of, well, do we train ourselves to do this and learn how to do this? Or do we, again, kind of press the easy button or ask for help? And I think most fleets want to do as much themselves as they can, especially recognizing that if they are developing or wanting to develop infrastructure at facilities that they own and control, they also want to be able to manage and service that equipment over the life of it and have a view of what the life of the equipment is going to be and how to transition over time. But ultimately, that process of training up takes time, even if the decision is to hire new folks who might have a level of experience to work that forward, it all takes time. And so back to tip number one, start as soon as you can. Don't wait.
Yeah.
And so I think that decision making around doing in-house, working with various partners, at the end of the day, you have to work with partners, whether that's just in ordering the equipment itself. And so I think that the early work to decide how much to do in-house, how much to do out-of-house is a really key point in this process. And again, there's no regrets associated with making that call to the utility, making that call to some of the potential infrastructure partners or experts out there.
All right. We've got a little less than 15 minutes to go. We've got some questions in the queue. If you do want to ask a question, now's the time to get it into the queue so we can ask. But let's wrap things up here for now, Tom and Hannah. Can you kind of summarize the challenges that fleets are facing and maybe go over those 3 key tips again for them?
Well, I'll say tip number 1, don't wait. Don't wait. Again, really simple to say, to remember, a little harder to implement, but again, step 1 is as simple as just giving your utility a call.
And I think that relates perfectly to tip 2, which is understanding all the phases that are going to be involved and really the durations associated with each, how they will happen concurrently or maybe dependent on each other, and who you're going to need support from, which leads into tip 3, which is engaging experts, for those stages to start increasing that knowledge you have today, all spearheading from this kind of get started, understand your strategy, start to piece together, and you'll set yourself up for success, whether it is in 12, 24, 48, months from now that you're really going to be going live.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. Very informative presentation. Appreciate it. A couple of questions here, and this one might be pertinent at this point. Can you give us an idea, just a quick rundown of what the CARB and EPA mandates for electrification are, some of the dates when we have to be up and running?
Sure.
Just not want to scare people, but it's closer than we think, isn't it?
Well, depends on what kind of fleet you are and where you're operating.
Where in the country, yeah.
Yeah, and so Jim, my strongest recommendation, if you are a fleet operating in California, go directly to the website of the California Air Resources Board associated, in this case, most likely with the Advanced Clean Fleet Regulation. What I would share at a high level is the fleets that are subject to that regulation, it's immediate. They are subject as of January 1, 2024. And if they're in the drayage segment, operating drayage trucks, they need to have those registered before the end of this year, 2023, to continue operating. And so that's right around the corner. I've heard from a number of fleets that have kind of rearranged their holiday and break plans to make sure that they've done everything sort of administratively that they need with CARB compliance there. There are obviously a number of other types of fleets, some of which may already be subject to other regulations in California. Jim, the EPA Phase 3 regulation, there is no date on that as yet. So that rulemaking was announced earlier this year. We don't yet know when EPA is going to finalize that. To be frank, we don't know if EPA will finalize it. My expectation is that they will, but they're definitely taking their time to make sure that they have a strong view of just what we're talking about today. What does it really take to enable the infrastructure necessary for fleets to comply with this type of regulation? And again, I would direct fleet managers or interested parties directly to EPA's website on phase 3. But certainly, the policy team at Volterra, very happy to be a resource to fleets on this topic.
Oh, well, given the urgency, the relative urgency of this, how can fleets strike a balance between the urgency of making this happen and still doing a thorough evaluation to ensure that the project is what they want it to be at the end? This isn't something you want to rush through, is it?
Well, indeed. And so I would just share, Jim, I think there are a lot of different perspectives about the Advanced Clean Fleet Regulation, how it was set up, how it may be enforced. But I think there are a lot of pathways for fleets to comply with the regulation, whether that's with, if you call it the letter of the regulation, or leveraging some of the, let's call them waiver pathways to, maybe delay the timeline in which they need to comply. Mm-hmm. One thing that I would flag, and it kind of goes back to the, don't wait. While a fleet may not be, unless they're subject to regulation, planning at this stage to transition the entirety of their fleet, the recommendation that I would share is to plan for infrastructure for the entirety of a fleet, even if that's 10 years down the road. Because that type of full fleet, full infrastructure assessment is really necessary to, one, understand if it's going to work to electrify an existing facility or whether a new facility may be implicated, and have an appropriate sense of costs and power requirements to be able to best engage the utility and have sort of that most efficient experience, even if it does take time.
And I would just add two things to that. One, it does seem daunting. I think that is the story we're trying to paint, but there is time. If you think about starting today and going that full 24 months to do it right, I think that you should still view that as a positive starting today. That has adequate planning time built into it. And then I'd say second, there are certainly ways to kind of ease into it, and we have helped develop for customers temporary charging, either on site or on temporary sites. You certainly don't want to invest a huge amount in that if it's going to be only a temporary strategy. But there are ways to kind of beef up existing power temporarily, put on some temporary chargers. That is a strategy we're actively helping folks with. So to the extent that needs to become a part of the implementation, rather by choice or by necessity because of the timelines, I think it's a strategy we can help with and you should think of as options.
We've been talking mostly today, in fact, almost entirely about electrification. Can you speak a little bit to the infrastructure required to support fuel cell vehicles, hydrogen refueling, and that kind of thing? Is that something Volterra is doing as well?
All right, I can start on that, Jim. So indeed, Volterra is very much exploring supporting the hydrogen fueling infrastructure need as fleets start transitioning to those vehicles. I think practically what I would share is it feels like many fleets are very excited about hydrogen, but the vehicles aren't necessarily as ready as they are in the electrification space. And so those fleets that are subject to regulation in California are making more asks associated with battery electric charging. What I would just share, I'm sure a lot have seen, what's been going on, but we as a country have invested quite a lot of money in developing these regional hydrogen hubs to aid in the production and really start setting up the supply chain. That is going to take some time. So would acknowledge that while it may take a little bit of time, 2 years, to electrify a facility, it may take more than that, not practically to deliver the hydrogen fueling infrastructure to a site, but to set up the hydrogen production supply chain to enable consistent hydrogen supply to that site. And so that tends to be a few years further off or away than what we're experiencing with battery electric charging.
It's probably worth pointing out, though, that some of the mandates still apply, whether you choose to go hydrogen or electric, correct? So you're still up against that calendar. Yeah. Well, I guess one final question. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Jim, lastly, I would just acknowledge many of the incentives apply as well to hydrogen fueling infrastructure and associated vehicles.
Okay. I think we've got time for one more quick question here before we wrap things up. Given the rapid advancements in technology and how fast things are changing, how can fleets sort of take steps to future-proof their installation so that from the day they conceive and get the idea they're going to do this to implementation, and then maybe 2 or 3 years down the road, 5 years into their plan, everything is still as valid as it was when they started out? Future-proofing.
Yeah, there's certainly a few strategies to keep in mind. I'd say, one is as much as you can think about your equipment selection and pair that with your discussion with the utility to future-proof, different size vehicles, different charging capacities, different throughput. If you have some of that thought early on, you can build capacity into your equipment, whether it's, delivered day one or you want to make that upgrade in 5, 7, however many years. If you contemplate that with your equipment selection and your trenching strategy, that should allow you to make a reasonable amount of changes. From a site design perspective, there's certainly some more modular efforts you can make if you're dropping in maybe some temporary storage or office space that then could get removed or changed if you do need to utilize that space differently at a different point in time. And I think, those are probably some good places to start when it comes to site layout and design.
And Jim, I might just reemphasize what I mentioned before. I mean, one of the biggest strategies for future-proofing, implementing what Hannah was sharing, is planning for the full fleet or the full facility. So it's not plan for 10% or a pilot. It's do the planning for the whole facility, have a view of the whole capacity that may be required over time, such that you don't have to go back to the utility or have sort of inefficient upgrades or investments made on the electrical side.
Great advice, Tom. Thanks for that. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to wrap things up for today. And we've used up all of our time. I'm sure there's lots more questions you still have. If you do, just email them to us and we'll make sure they get answered. I'd like to thank our two presenters today, Tom Ashley. He's the Vice President of Government and Utility Operations at Volterra Power, and Hannah Jacobus, Vice President of Real Estate and Development. I blew that first time, too, at Volterra Power. I'm Jim Park, the Equipment Editor at Heavy Duty Trucking Magazine. I thank you all for your time today and hope you took something away for this. Take care and have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim.